So welcome everybody. Thank you for coming along. Just to give you a bit of background, so I specialize in working with sensitive data. Now, I've been doing this for around 10 years, although not all at GESIS. I originally started in this type of work in the UK and I moved over to GESIS just over 2.5 years ago now. But I've been working in services that provide access to these kinds of data for around 10 years. And I'm going to talk today really about how we manage the risk that this entails. So just first of all, to situate ourselves so that you know where we stand. So we are based in the data services for the social sciences, and you can see highlighted our area, which is risk and sensitive data. And as we go through the session today, you'll come to understand that really the job that certainly I do is all about managing risk. So trying to assess where risk is and working out how we mitigate that. So as it was mentioned, this is the last one in our department series. So hopefully you've had a chance to see some of the others. If not, go and have a look at the recordings. But it's my job and my colleague's job, who is on vacation, so she's not here with us today. It's our job really to wrap up the series and wrap up the year of some great presentations. So what am I going to cover? So what I want to do just to start with is just to set out some key terms. You may be familiar with this area already, but I never like to make that assumption. So I'm going to start by talking about what do we actually mean when we talk about sensitive data? And then I'm going to go on and talk about the role of a trusted research environment. So if you haven't heard this term before, don't worry, I will explain what it is. But it's a really important term, and it really describes how we go about making access to these data possible. Then I'm going to get a lot more specific and talk about what that looks like in practice. So what do we do here? And I will introduce the Secure Data Center, which is where I work, and I'll talk a lot about our role with secure data access. Now, just to preempt what's coming, we have been through a process over the last couple of years of revising what we do and working out how we can improve our service and how we can move to new access routes. Now, that always sounds so simple, but there's a lot to think about. And I'm going to talk about that process. And I'm going to draw in the 5 safes framework. And again, if you haven't heard of that, don't worry, I will explain it. All right, so that's what's on the agenda. So let's think about sensitive data first of all. Now, there are so many different terms for this, and depending on what service you interact with or what country you're in, you will hear different terms for essentially the same thing. So for example, you might hear sensitive data, secure data, confidential data, legally protected data. You'll hear all the legal terms flying around. And you'll hear different terms for the access routes, remote desktops, safe room, safe havens. And we tend to get a bit caught up in the jargon. So let's try and just simplify it a little bit. Now, if we think about data, we can try and simplify this by thinking of 3 main categories. And we start off with what we would think of as identifiable data. Now, this is a data set which includes literally everything as it is collected. So this is data that might include names or emails that have name details in, or social security numbers, these kinds of things, which will directly identify an individual. Now, these are the kinds of data that if we've done our job properly, will never be made available through a data archive. This is the we might think about this as the raw data or the source data. And then we have, at the opposite end, we have anonymized data. And this is data which has had sufficient information taken out of it to ensure that there is no risk, or at least a negligible risk, of an individual being identified. And working with anonymized data is much more simple if we can think of it that way. So these are the kinds of data that you can come to somewhere like GESIS and download and store and work with that on your own computer system. And I think most of us are really familiar with working with these kinds of data. But one of the problems with data is when we anonymize it, we have to do that through stripping out information. And in most cases, if we strip out sufficient information to make it anonymous, it's fine. It doesn't reduce the level of utility of the data too much. But there are some cases where, in order to make something fully anonymized, we have to strip out so much information that actually it's not really very useful anymore for research. So what we've seen in sort of recent decades is this move towards pseudonymized or factually anonymized data. And these are data sets which contain still most of the data. Really what we've done is we've stripped out all of these direct identifiers, but we know that there is sufficient information in there to still potentially indirectly identify somebody. And we sometimes think of this as jigsaw identification. So we may not have their name, but we would know the small geographical area that they live in. We might know their ethnicity or their age. And we can start to piece these pieces of information together to build up a complete picture. And it's in this middle category that we find what we call sensitive data. So this is data that we know is potentially identifiable. And of course, once we know that this risk exists, we have to put appropriate safeguards around the data. We can't just allow this to be downloaded. So this is where the trusted research environments come in. Now, this is a relatively new term, and I'm using the definition from the Health Data Research UK because it's I think a very succinct definition. So a trusted research environment is a highly secure computational environment that provides remote access to sensitive data, in this case health data, that can be used for approved research. And there are other terms for a TRE, so safe haven, secure data service, secure data center. All of these terms essentially are talking about the same thing. And the role of these environments, these TREs, is to enable us to ensure that when researchers use these data, they're doing it safely and ethically. And they're important because without these kinds of environments, we simply would not be allowed to share these kinds of data. So this is really the mechanism by which we were able to start sharing these very detailed data. And they play an important role in building trust within not just the research community, but they enable data owners to feel that they can trust us with their data. They enable data subjects, the people who are in the surveys, to feel confident that they can share their data safely with us. So, you know, what we do here in somewhere like the Secure Data Center has a crucial role in the research community. Now, before we go on to talking about what data access looks like, I want to just give you a quick potted history. So when we started to open up access to these kinds of data, the access was only through a physical safe room or safe haven. And this meant that researchers have to come to a specific room within the institution who was making the data available. And that was the only possibility that existed to start with. And in probably the last decade, we've seen this move towards exploring remote access. And in some parts of the world, this is now the dominant means of access. In Germany, we do have remote access. It's newer here. So for a lot of services, we still have physical safe rooms as the dominant access route, but we are making great progress towards opening up remote access. And there are three main ways that we can do this: remote access, remote desktop, and remote execution. I'm going to talk about remote access and remote desktop because that's more relevant to the work that we do at GESIS. So I'm not going to talk about remote execution, but I do know about it. So if anybody particularly has questions about that, please do feel free to ask at the Q&A at the end. So I want to introduce us. So we are the Secure Data Center. We are based here in GESIS. I like to call us a developing trusted research environment at TRE. We're not fully there because one of the characteristics of a TRE is remote access. And as you'll find out as we go through, we have some remote access, but not yet remote desktop. So we're on the way, we're developing, but we still have a little way to go. Essentially, in one sentence, our role is to provide access to sensitive data, mostly from key German social surveys, and increasingly we're going to be seeing sensitive digital behavioral data coming to us as well. I'll talk more about this as we go, but we also provide access to sensitive data from the UK and France. If you haven't visited us before, we are based in Cologne, and our primary access route is on site via our safe room, which is in tract B of the Cologne building. We also have on-site access, which is possible via the safe rooms in GESIS Mannheim and the UK Data Service over in the UK. And we've been doing a lot of development work recently to move further along the remote path to exploring different access systems. Now, if this is completely new to you, this is sort of a really, really simplistic view of what our model of access is. So essentially, regardless of the type of access route, you have your data which is stored on a secure server, which is in location A, and that's usually in the secure server in the institution that's providing access. So for the secure data center, all of the data is stored on the secure servers within GESIS. And then through secure VPNs, a person in some other location is able to log in to our servers and access their project areas. Now, this is a very basic module, as you can see. And as we go through the different access routes, and I'll talk a little bit about what they look like, the thing that really moves or changes is the location of our researcher. So we start off just by talking a little bit about safe room access. Now, this is something you may be quite familiar with, and it's a very simple setup. So the researcher comes to our premises and they sit in a special secured room. Now, there's a reason this is where we started, is really around the fact that we can control virtually everything. So we can put in physical controls, such as we can lock the rooms and make them only accessible through us. We can have things like thin clients, which is what we use, which prevent the researcher from accessing anything other than the virtual machine, which is specifically for their projects. And this means that the virtual environment that they log into is completely sealed. So they can't access any other drives, they can't access the internet, they can't bring a USB and connect that. It's completely sealed. It's also a common control that researchers can't bring any personal belongings into the room. So they will have lockers near the room, usually just outside the room, and researchers will have to leave everything there before they enter the room. And this really is extremely safe, extremely secure, and we do have a large degree of control. Now, this is a picture of a safe room, nothing very dramatic. I get people ask if they can come and visit, and I always have this impression that they think there's something very exciting in there. It really isn't. It's just a room that has the thin clients and the workstations in there. Now, we like safe rooms because we can control everything and they're very secure, but they have a lot of downsides, which is why we've really been moving away from them. So the first disadvantage is for our poor researchers. So unless you happen to live in the same city as the safe room, you will have to travel. And if you want to travel, if you want to come and work for a week, you have to pre-book it in advance. You have to pay for the travel. You have to take the week away from your office. You have accommodation costs. So really, unless you have, a nice funding grant or your university has good budgets, this requirement to travel and all of the costs that are included is going to be prohibitive for some researchers. There's also restrictions on when you can work. So you can't just think, oh, I've got half an hour spare, I'm going to log in and do a bit of work. You have to book in advance. You have to try and guess how long it's going to take you to do something. And if you book for a day and you come for a day and you get to the time that the safe room closes and you think, oh my goodness, I've only got half an hour left. Unless, some safe room staff will try and accommodate you as much as possible, but we can't stay open all night. It's frustrating because for that extra half hour, you may have to arrange to come back on a separate day. And this becomes particularly problematic when you look at the researchers we have visit us. Last year, which is the first sort of post-pandemic set of figures we have, actually 2/3 of our visitors come from outside of Germany. So this is not a simple practical solution for researchers. There's also limited availability. So we have 4 workstations in Cologne and we have 2 in external locations. And that's fine. Actually, that's a pretty standard size for a safe room. But if we have 7 people who want to come, then we don't have room. So people have to wait. So there are disadvantages. And of course, we have to mention the pandemic because, we always have to mention the pandemic. And this really caused a lot of problems for a service like ours because we have on-site access only. So the second the first lockdown was announced, we had to close and our doors had to stay closed. Actually, we were closed throughout the entire pandemic period. And that's really, really disruptive for researchers. There's just really nothing we could have done. And there might be other unforeseen events short of a pandemic. So what the pandemic really did for us was to make us realize that now is the time we have to think about alternative access routes, because not that we wish to go through another pandemic anytime soon, but it has made us very aware that the access route that we have is very vulnerable to unforeseen events. And this is really what has pushed forward the bid to move towards remote access. So as I mentioned, there are several options that we can look at. So option one is what we call here remote access. Now, this is actually still based on safe room access. But what's different here, the remote element, is that the safe room is not one of ours, and it's not based in our building at Cologne. But it's located at a partner organization. And we provide access through bilateral agreements and secure technical connections. So it's exactly the same model as I showed you earlier. It's just the location of our researcher has now moved. And this is a really good first step because it enables us to retain all of the physical controls of a safe room, but it offers more flexibility. So we can start to tackle some of the issues of the safe room without losing the benefits of it. So it's a really nice compromise, if you like. We can build our capacity, so we have extra workstations available to us. The researcher is more likely to have a location that's closer to them. So if we've had a couple of research teams that are based in the UK, they don't have to travel to Germany anymore. They can just travel over to Essex, which is where the UK data service is based. Still a little bit of travel, but it's a lot easier than traveling internationally. It's also easy to implement, and I say easier in brackets because it's not simple, but it is the easier option to implement. And we've set up a few of these now, so we've kind of learned the pitfalls, and we have some really good workflows now. And there are many of these types of things. So there's the SafePod network, which is still in the UK, although there's some early talks about whether there's scope to extend that. We have things like IDAN, which is the International Data Access Network, and SHOC, which is the Social Sciences and Humanities Open Cloud. And these two projects have been really, really dominant and really active in opening up remote connections between different European countries. So we've made some really, really good progress through these projects. And one that's just within Germany, which is called RDC Net. This is still relatively in the early stages, but the idea of RDC Net is to build a networked access within Germany between a number of different partners. And we are one of the pilot partners. So keep an eye on that. And I just want to show you a case study really of the connection that we set up as part of the SHOC project. So we set up 2 unilateral agreements between GESIS and the UK Data Service, and we've set up 3 thin clients. So there's one in the UKDS, they call their service Secure Lab, and there's one in our safe room in Cologne, and there's one in the safe room in Mannheim. And what this means is researchers can come to Cologne or Mannheim and access the UKDS data, but also researchers can go to the UKDS and access GESIS data. So this was huge. It was a lot of work, but we're really happy with the outcome. And we had our first live research visit in September 2022. So we had 2 researchers from the University of Oxford who travelled to the UKDS to access sensitive data made available through the Secure Data Centre. And we've had further visits since. And just because I like to have a positive reflection on the benefits, this was the quote that the researchers gave us. They were really happy. Everything, thank goodness, worked really smoothly. We had no problems with the technical connections. So this was a huge cause to celebrate for both services. Okay, so that's one option, and we are making really good progress there. And there are projects in the pipeline that will further develop new connections. So let's talk about option number 2, which is remote desktop. Now, this still is based around our basic model. But this time, what happens is the researcher doesn't come to a safe room, they sit in their own office. So this is their office in their own institution. And you can imagine the advantages for this for researchers. They don't have to go anywhere. They don't have to schedule visits in advance. If they've got half an hour before lunch that they can spare and they want to just nip in and rerun a model, they can do it. I mean, it's so much more flexible. And it expands capacity because we're no longer tied to the number of physical workstations we can provide. So it is an entirely positive step forward. Of course, it's not quite that simple. The reality is remote desktop access is actually really complex to implement in terms of, you know, the technical development that's needed, but also the legislative, the processes that we have to put in. And this really is because we lose many of the physical controls that we're able to have with safe room access. And we can't just say, oh, it doesn't matter that we can't check people's ID, or it doesn't matter that we don't, you know, we can't control whether a researcher sat there with their laptop and their smartphone taking pictures. We can't just say that. We have to find some way of replacing these safeguards. Otherwise, what we have is a security model which is weak and it's not going to be sufficient. So it's great for researchers, a little bit more of a headache for those of us who are trying to implement the service. And one of the ways that most services actually, certainly in parts of the world that have very established remote desktop services, tend to use what's called the 5 safes framework. And this is a very simple framework, which it was developed in 2003 by Professor Felix Ritchie, who visited GESIS a few weeks ago. And the idea is that this is a mechanism that TREs can use to think through where is the risk and what can we do to mitigate it. And the beauty of this framework is it's not a strictly prescriptive tool. It's something that's adaptable. So it's a way of ordering our thinking. So the 5 safes are essentially safe projects, people, data, setting, and outputs. And you can see the description of what each one is. And the idea is that you adjust depending on your requirements. So if you have a safe room, as we do at the moment, then we have a lot of controls over the safe setting. And we don't have to worry quite so much about the safe people, for example. Once we shift from on-site, we have fewer controls on safe setting, so we have to increase the controls in some of the other areas. And that's really the process that we're going through at the moment. at the Secure Data Centre. We've been reviewing our processes to see where we can tweak our security model to make sure it's appropriate still. And the idea is that if you balance all of these 5 properly, the use of the data is going to be safe, even if it's remote access. So here are just some of the things that we've been thinking about. So the first thing is really around the setting, and I'm going to start there because this is the technical part. So we're losing all of these controls. So we no longer can be 100% sure we have a locked room. We can't control things like ID. We can't check people's passports when they arrive, for example. We can't check whether researchers are writing down notes and taking them away. So some of the things in terms of the technical development that we've been looking at is we can add things like 2-factor authentication. We can add requirements for people's workstations. So, for example, in the UK, generally researchers have to have a private office, or they have to demonstrate if they share their office, their screens are not going to be overlooked by people walking past. These kinds of things. There used to be a very heavy requirement for fixed IP addresses. But as institutions have moved towards hot desking, this is actually becoming quite problematic. So there's a lot of work in the UK to look at how we cope with that. So we can add all of these things, but we have to add in some non-technical controls now, because this on its own is not going to be sufficient. So the first area where we're looking at non-technical controls is around the projects. Now, regardless of what service you apply for data through, you will have to complete some form of agreement. And this is really a legal contract that exists between you and the data service providing access. They vary wildly, to be honest, but they all have common factors. So they set out really who can access what data for what purpose and for how long. And the detail around that varies from service to service. But these are essentially setting out the terms and conditions. So what can you do and what can't you do? So we've been having a look at whether our own data use agreement, which you can see on the screen, is still going to be sufficient. And one of the things that we really did when we started to work on setting up connections between us and the UKDS was we realized we didn't have a license compliance policy, which is required for these kinds of access. And this really sets out our policy of if a researcher does something that they know they're not supposed to do, we have to have some mechanism that we can go back to them. You know, we have some recourse. One of the other areas that we can look at is whether we have institutional agreements. So a lot of places that have remote desktop access will have an agreement with the researcher, but they will also have a separate agreement with the institution as well. And that essentially means that the institution is taking responsibility for the researcher behaving in the manner that they are supposed to. We don't have any decisions on that front. They are, from my experience in the UK, really hard to administer, but they also have some benefits. So moving on to the next sort of non-technical bit. This is around the idea of safe people. Now, really what we're saying is that researchers that come and work with these data should have the necessary knowledge for working with secure data or sensitive data. And we know that the sort of things researchers need to be aware of is very rarely taught anywhere. So, for example, even researchers who have undergone a lot of research data management training, it doesn't really cover things like safe outputs, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So it doesn't talk about how to ensure that the research you publish, the results you publish, can those results be used to identify something? These kind of things which we need researchers to know about, it just isn't taught. It is relatively common sense, but it's something that we, as researchers, we never think about until we have to. And we also know from experience that no matter how much effort we put into writing guidance, and, you know, I'm working through the guidance that we provide and trying to make that better. But we know that no matter how hard we try, researchers don't always read the instructions, or they read them, but there's something that they don't quite understand. So one of the things that remote desktop services tend to have in common is that they have some requirement for training before a researcher can access the data. And this has a number of benefits, really. I mean, quite simply, when a researcher undergoes this kind of training, they are far less likely to make this kind of mistakes that can prove harmful to a data subject. I mean, it really is that simple. As a plus side, the process of working with researchers who have some training makes the whole process of analyzing sensitive data and publishing results much more efficient. So researchers need a lot less support because they don't have to ask some of the basic questions that we see. So this is another area that we're working quite hard on. And there is a project which is still relatively new, but we're sort of making a little bit of headway, which is called Accrediting Safe Use of Research Environments, or Assured. And this is a collaboration between us at GESIS, the German Human Genome Phenome Archive, and Baird at NFDI. And we're working together to develop a suite of e-learning modules which cover exactly the kinds of things we need researchers to know. And some of those will be core modules that we will want all researchers to go through. So learning perhaps about the 5 safes, learning about checking outputs for disclosure risks. Some of them will be service specific. So the Bundesbank are very interested in this, these modules. So we would have a service specific module. So how to use the GESIS safe environment, how to use the GHGA cloud that they're developing, how to use the Bundesbank research platform. And then we have the capacity to add in other things as we see appropriate. So if we have a service which does a lot of data linking, we can add in modules in this area, or how to use very specialized data like genomics. What we also recognize, because myself and the partner from GHGA, we've worked in secure environments, TREs, for many years. We recognize that staff in TREs have no formal training either. And this is a problem that TREs really across the world are beginning to think about. We don't have formal training, and we really, really should do. So we've added on a stream for people that work in TREs as well. So we're in the early stages, but keep an eye on this. And then the final area really is safe outputs. Now, if you're not familiar, what we mean is that in the research results that a researcher wants to publish, we know that there is still a risk of an individual being identified or having some attribute assigned to them, which is confidential. And so the aim of safer outputs is to minimize this risk, because we know the risk is actually very minimal. It's not a huge risk, but we know it exists. So we have to really demonstrate that we have thought about this and we keep it negligible. And the tool that we do that, the method we use, is called statistical disclosure control. And I mean, this is a very simple process. And we have to bear in mind this concept of the unprovability of safety. So there is no such thing as zero risk, no matter what we do. The second you collect a piece of data about somebody, there is risk involved. So the aim is really to demonstrate that we've taken all reasonable measures to ensure that this risk is as close to zero as it possibly can be. And really, SDC comes down to a set of sensitivity rules that are applied to outputs before they can be released for publication. And that's applied in different ways across all TREs. So we've been doing some work to re-look at our own set of sensitivity rules and just make sure that they meet the internationally recognized standards. Now, the thing about SDC is it's what we call a four eyes approach. And essentially that means every piece of output is checked by two people independently. And as you can imagine, some of the outputs are quite big and it's a very time-consuming, laborious process. So we're doing a couple of pieces of work to try and help. The first thing is we are currently working with a project in the UK to test a new semi-automated output checking program, which some of the other services in the UK that have been testing this for longer than us, they're really happy with the way it works. So I'm super hopeful that we can implement that here, because if we can make the process less laborious and less resource intensive, that's a real game changer for us. I'm also working with the STAP team, which is the Safe Data Access Professionals group, to update this handbook that you can see, which is basically the kind of Bible for output checkers that a lot of services across the world use. So we've been pretty busy. So that's really what we've been up to over the last couple of years, and the direction that we're heading really is, our goal is to expand data access to sensitive data. I mean, this is really the goal that we have. So we want to make this access easier and more flexible. So we don't want people having to fly from different parts of Europe and the world just to come and access data. We want to try and open it up a bit. We are looking at trying to get a wider variety of data, and that's going to include some of the new data forms like the DVD data. And the other thing that we're working really hard through some of the big EU projects is to try and dissolve some of the boundaries. So we've done some work with Shock and IDAN, as you've seen, to try and dissolve some of these international boundaries. And there are also some really interesting projects which are trying to break down the boundaries between academic disciplines, so that we in the social sciences can learn from the hard sciences and the humanities and vice versa. So we're really trying to stop this process where we're all sat alone reinventing the wheel when we don't need to be doing that. And I just wanted to finish with one thought, which again is something that we don't reflect on enough. And that is, with secure access, TREs, all of this stuff, essentially what we are doing is building trust. No service is 100% secure. No data is 100% anonymized. So as a research community, as a TRE community, our role is to build trust and maintain trust. And we have to demonstrate this to the wider world on a daily basis. And that's something that I've been reflecting on quite a lot more recently. All right, so I think that's all of the content that I had. So this is just the contact details for the consultancy services. There's my email address, although you can also search on the internet. I pop up